The haunted painting.
The rain poured relentlessly outside the old Victorian house, its windows rattling under the force of the wind. Inside, the Sinclair family sat huddled in the dimly lit living room, still surrounded by unopened boxes from their recent move. The flickering light of a single candle barely illuminated the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. It had been a long, exhausting week of packing, moving, and unpacking into their inherited home. A grand but unsettling mansion passed down from a distant deceased relative none of them had ever met. Emily Sinclair, the youngest of the family, was the first to notice the painting. "Who's that, Mom?" she asked, her finger pointing towards the dark corner of the room. Her mother, Claire, turned to see what her daughter was referring to. The painting had arrived with the rest of the inherited items. It was large and ornate, framed in gilded gold, and featured a woman in an elegant burgundy dress from an era long gone. Her face was soft with delicate features, but there was something unsettling about her expression, a distant sadness that seemed to draw you in. She stood against a backdrop of heavy red drapery, her hands clasped in front of her, fingers twisted as if in anticipation. It was beautiful but haunting in its realism. "I don't know, sweetheart. It must have belonged to the original owners," Claire said, her voice sounding unconvinced even to herself. "She looks weird," Emily said, stepping closer to the painting. "Leave it, Emily," Claire warned softly, feeling a chill in the room that wasn't due to the weather. "It's just a painting." But Emily didn't move. Instead, she stared, her eyes fixed on the woman's face. "She looks sad," she said quietly. Claire shivered, pulling Emily away. "Come on, let's finish up for the night. We'll unpack more tomorrow," Claire said, hoping to distract her daughter. They moved to the kitchen where the rest of the family was seated. David, Claire's husband, and their teenage son, Josh. The wind outside howled, and the lights flickered ominously as they ate dinner. The atmosphere was thick with tension, though no one could quite place why. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Claire found herself awake, tossing and turning under her thick blankets. She felt an unshakable unease about the house, the painting, and the strange energy that seemed to cling to the walls. Finally, after hours of restless sleep, she gave up and decided to head downstairs for a glass of water. As Claire descended the staircase, she noticed something odd. The air felt colder than it should have. The hairs on her arms stood up, and her feet, bare against the hardwood floor, ached from the chill. When she reached the living room, the candle she had extinguished earlier flickered back to life, its flame small but persistent. Her gaze drifted to the painting, and her breath caught in her throat. The woman's expression had changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but it had. The sadness was still there, but there was something more, a look of fatigue, of weariness, as if the weight of years had suddenly been thrust upon her. Her once smooth, youthful face appeared slightly lined, her cheeks a little sunken. Claire blinked, rubbing her eyes in disbelief. "That's impossible," she whispered to herself. She took a step closer, examining the painting in the dim light. Was it just a trick of the shadows? The woman's eyes, once serene, seemed to be slightly bloodshot now, and the delicate smile that had once touched her lips had faded into a grimace of pain. Claire felt her heart race as she backed away from the painting, a knot of dread tightening in her chest. She hurried back to bed, convincing herself that the stress of the move and lack of sleep were playing tricks on her mind. It was just a painting. It couldn't change. The following day, Claire told David about what she had seen, though she downplayed her fears, embarrassed to admit how disturbed she had felt. "It's nothing, just my imagination," she said, though she could see that David was only half listening, absorbed in his work emails. He shrugged it off, offering a casual comment about old houses and their quirks. As the days passed, the painting became an unsettling presence in the house. Claire found herself glancing at it constantly, as if expecting the woman to move or shift when no one was looking. But it wasn't until the end of the first week that she saw the change again. It was subtle, just like before. The woman now appeared visibly older, her youthful complexion giving way to fine lines and wrinkles. The once bright eyes seemed duller, her hair thinner, and her lips, formerly full and red, were now pale and chapped. A sense of growing dread gnawed at Claire. She knew the painting was aging, changing, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything to her family. Who would believe her? But Claire wasn't the only one who noticed. Josh, who had previously dismissed the old mansion as boring, started spending more time in his room, avoiding the living room where the painting hung. One night, as Claire passed by his door, she overheard him talking to Emily in hushed tones. "Have you seen it?" Josh asked, his voice tinged with fear. "The painting, it's changing." Claire's heart sank. She wasn't imagining it. Something was wrong with the painting, and whatever it was getting worse. Claire stood frozen outside Josh's room, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. The dread that had been quietly gnawing at her chest for days now flared into full-blown panic. If Josh had noticed the changes too, then something was very wrong. It wasn't just her sleep-deprived mind playing tricks on her. The painting was changing. She debated whether to walk in and confront them, but hesitated, unsure of how much they had seen. Instead, she backed away quietly, retreating to her bedroom. David was already asleep, oblivious to the growing unease that seemed to engulf the house. Claire climbed under the covers and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She needed to figure out what was going on, but where could she even begin? That night, Claire's dreams were a tangled mess of shadows and whispers. She saw the woman from the painting, her face aging in rapid bursts, her once beautiful features distorting into something grotesque. The woman's eyes, once sad and human, became wild, almost predatory as her lips curled into a malicious sneer. Then, in the dream, the woman turned, looking directly at Claire, her mouth opening to speak, but no words came out. Only a deep, guttural growl that shook Claire awake, her body drenched in cold sweat. The next morning, Claire could no longer deny what was happening. She had to get rid of the painting. It was the only way to stop the growing sense of doom that seemed to emanate from it. After breakfast, she pulled David aside, trying to broach the subject delicately. "David," she began cautiously, "I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but there's something wrong with that painting." He barely glanced up from his phone. "What?" "The painting in the living room. What could be wrong with it?" "I don't know. It's changing. I swear the woman in it is aging. Every night she looks older." David chuckled softly. "You've been watching too many horror movies, Claire. It's just a painting. Old paintings can be a little creepy, but that's all." "No," Claire insisted, her voice rising slightly. "Josh and Emily have noticed it too. It's not just me." This made David pause. He set his phone down and studied Claire's face. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. I know it sounds insane, but something's happening. We need to get rid of it." David sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, let's take a look." They went into the living room together. In the daylight, the painting didn't seem quite as ominous as it did at night, but as soon as Claire looked at it, she knew. The woman had aged again. There were deep lines now etched into her once smooth skin. Her eyes, once sorrowful, were clouded over with a milky glaze, and her once elegant hands were now gnarled, the fingers bent and twisted in unnatural ways. David frowned as he stared at the portrait. "It does look a little different," he admitted reluctantly. "But maybe it's just the lighting or—" "No," Claire cut him off. "It's changing, David. I've watched it happen. We need to get rid of it. Tonight." David hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll take it down tonight and move it to the attic." That evening, after the kids were in bed, David fetched a stepladder and began to remove the painting from the wall. As he worked, the house seemed unusually quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Claire stood nearby, anxiously watching. When David finally lifted the painting from its hook, an unexpected gust of cold air swept through the room, rattling the windows and causing the candle on the mantel to flicker violently. "Did you feel that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. David grunted as he carried the painting down from the ladder. "It's just the wind," he said, though he sounded unconvinced. He turned the painting around to examine the back, looking for some clue as to its origin. There's nothing here, no signature, no date. Weird. Claire stepped closer, her skin prickling as she stared at the now bare wall where the painting had hung. Just get it out of here. David carried the painting up to the attic, grumbling to himself about the strange request. He leaned it against an old trunk and closed the attic door behind him. Claire let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Maybe now, with the painting out of sight, things would return to normal. But that night, the house remained eerily still. No wind, no rattling windows, just silence. Around midnight, Claire woke to the sound of something soft scraping against the floor above them. The attic. She sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. No, it was just her imagination. It had to be. But then she heard it again. A slow, deliberate scrape, like something heavy being dragged. She shook David awake. "David, do you hear that?" He groaned, groggy and confused. "What? I don't hear anything." "That noise. From the attic." David listened for a moment, but the sound had stopped. "It's nothing, Claire. Probably just the house settling." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling of dread. She stayed awake, listening for the slightest hint of the noise returning, but the night passed without further incident. The following day, Emily was the first to notice something strange. "Mom, the painting's back." Claire's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, back?" "It's in the living room," Emily said innocently, pointing to the wall where the painting had originally hung. Claire rushed to the living room, her heart thudding in her chest. There, back on the wall, was the painting. The woman in the portrait now looked ancient. Her face was a mask of sagging skin, her eyes sunken and hollow, and her hands were little more than skeletal claws. The transformation was unmistakable now. The woman wasn't just aging, she was becoming something monstrous. "David!" Claire screamed, her voice filled with panic. David came running, and when he saw the painting back on the wall, his face turned pale. How did it get back here?" "I don't know," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "But we need to destroy it now." They didn't hesitate. David grabbed the painting and hauled it outside into the backyard. He fetched a can of gasoline from the shed and doused the canvas. Claire stood by, watching anxiously as he struck a match and tossed it onto the painting. The flames roared to life, engulfing the canvas in a violent blaze. The woman's face distorted in the heat, her monstrous features warping as the fire consumed the painting. For a moment, Claire thought she heard a low, guttural scream echo through the air, but it was swallowed by the crackling of the flames. As the painting was reduced to ashes, the wind picked up again, carrying the smoke away into the night sky. Claire stood there, staring at the charred remains, praying that whatever curse had been tied to the painting had been destroyed with it. But as they turned to go back inside, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of the woman in the painting. And she was right. The Sinclair family tried to resume life as normal after the fire. David had disposed of the charred remains of the painting, scattering the ashes far from the house in a field on the outskirts of town. Claire hoped that the bizarre events tied to the portrait had been buried along with it, but deep down she wasn't so sure. The eerie sense of something unseen lingering in the house refused to dissipate. At first, the days seemed peaceful. The oppressive atmosphere that had clung to the house like a thick fog lifted. Even the kids seemed lighter, laughing more as they helped unpack the last of the boxes. Claire almost allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was over. Then, just as the family began to settle into a new routine, small things started happening again. Claire noticed them first. Items moved from their original places, whispers echoing through the halls late at night, faint knocks coming from behind the walls. She tried to convince herself that it was just the old house settling. But deep down, the pit of dread in her stomach was growing. She could feel it. The darkness was still there, waiting, watching. A week after burning the painting, the first truly disturbing incident occurred. It was just after midnight when Claire woke to the sound of footsteps. They were light and measured, creeping up the stairs outside the bedroom door. At first, she thought it was David returning from a late trip to the bathroom. But when she turned over, she saw him fast asleep beside her. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Her heart hammered in her chest as she strained to listen. Slowly, the door creaked open. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she watched it swing inward, revealing nothing but the darkened hallway. There was no one there. Yet she could still hear the footsteps, soft, deliberate, as though something invisible were pacing just beyond the doorway. "David," she whispered, shaking him awake. "David, do you hear that?" David groggily opened his eyes and listened. For a few seconds the house was still. Then they both heard it, the unmistakable creak of floorboards under invisible feet. David bolted upright, his face pale. What the hell? Without thinking, he jumped out of bed, grabbing the nearest object, a flashlight from the bedside table, and stormed toward the hallway. He switched on the light and pointed it into the darkness, illuminating nothing but the empty space. But the footsteps continued, moving slowly down the hall and into the living room. "I'm going to check it out," David whispered, his voice shaky but determined. "Wait," Claire begged, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong. Don't go." David shook his head. "We can't just sit here." Reluctantly, Claire followed him as he descended the stairs, her hands shaking with every step. When they reached the living room, the air was ice cold. Claire's breath fogged in front of her as the temperature dropped and the flickering candle on the mantel went out. And then they saw it. The painting, or rather, what was left of it. Sitting in the center of the living room floor was the scorched frame of the painting they had burned. Its edges were blackened and splintered, but within it, the faint outline of the woman's face could still be seen. Her eyes were dull and lifeless, her mouth twisted into a grotesque snarl. Claire gasped, stumbling backward in horror. How? How is that possible? We burned it. We destroyed it." David's face was ashen. He stepped toward the painting, but as he reached down to touch it, the air in the room grew even colder. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the walls, making the floorboards vibrate beneath their feet. "We need to leave," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to get out of this house." David was about to respond when a deafening bang came from upstairs. They both flinched, their heads snapping toward the sound. Claire's heart sank. The children. "Josh! Emily!" Claire screamed, bolting up the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps as she raced toward her kids' rooms. David was right behind her, the fear in his eyes mirroring her own. Claire threw open Josh's door first. The room was dark, but she could see his figure sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide with terror. "Mom," he whispered, his voice shaking. "She's here." Claire's blood ran cold. "Who? Who's here?" Josh pointed to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to thicken. Curling and twisting like smoke. Claire squinted, her eyes struggling to adjust in the dark, and then she saw it, an indistinct shape, barely visible but unmistakable. It was the woman from the painting, her grotesque form standing silently in the corner, watching them. Her skin was pale and translucent, stretched tightly over her bones, and her eyes were hollow pits of darkness. "Get out of here!" David shouted, grabbing Josh's arm and pulling him from the bed. Claire rushed to Emily's room, where she found her daughter curled up under the covers, trembling in fear. "She's in my room too," Emily sobbed, her small voice barely audible through her tears. "She's everywhere." Claire's heart shattered, but she forced herself to stay calm. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, gathering Emily into her arms. "We're leaving right now." They hurried down the stairs, but the house had other plans. As they reached the bottom, the front door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. David lunged for the doorknob, yanking it hard, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he said, his voice frantic as he pulled at the door. "It won't open." Claire turned to look back at the living room. The charred painting was gone. In its place stood the woman, fully visible now, her grotesque form towering in the center of the room. Her mouth hung open, but instead of words, a low, keening wail escaped her lips, echoing through the house. David grabbed a chair and smashed it against the door, splintering the wood. "Go!" he shouted, pushing Claire and the kids through the broken opening. They scrambled outside, stumbling into the cold night air. They ran. Claire didn't look back until they reached the car. Only then did she dare to turn around, half expecting to see the woman following them out into the yard. but the house stood silent and still, its dark windows watching them like hollow eyes. The wail had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. David started the car and they sped away, leaving the house and the horrors within it behind. But even as they drove, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, clinging to the shadows just out of sight. The Sinclairs didn't return to the house. They stayed in a hotel that night, and the next morning Claire called a realtor to put the house on the market. She didn't care about the inheritance anymore. She just wanted to be free of the nightmare that had plagued their family. But as they packed up their things and prepared to leave town for good, Claire couldn't escape the nagging thought that the curse wasn't bound to the house. 3 days later, as she was closing the trunk of the car, preparing to leave, Emily tugged on her sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. Claire knelt down. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emily hesitated, then pointed to the back seat. "She's here," she said softly. "She's sitting with us." Claire's blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned to look at the back seat. The reflection in the rearview mirror showed only the empty seats, empty except for a faint, almost imperceptible shadow sitting between Josh and Emily. The woman from the painting had found them, and she wasn't going to let them go. The car ride out of town was suffocatingly silent. David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as the tension in the vehicle weighed down on everyone. Claire sat in the passenger seat, trying to hold herself together, her mind racing with Emily's last words. The little girl's voice still echoed in her head. "She's here. She's sitting with us." Claire hadn't dared to look back again. David glanced at Claire, his eyes filled with concern. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than her. Claire didn't respond. She stared straight ahead, watching the road disappear beneath them as they sped away from the house that had turned their lives into a nightmare. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The woman from the painting, whatever it was, wasn't just tied to the house. She had latched onto their family, and the realization was like a lead weight sinking into Claire's chest. Emily had fallen asleep, her small body slumped against Josh's shoulder in the back seat. Josh, too, was dozing off, his face still pale from the horrors they had witnessed. Claire turned to check on them, her eyes darting quickly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow Emily had mentioned. But the reflection showed nothing out of the ordinary, just her 2 children huddled together. Still, the sense of something else lingering in the car wouldn't leave her. The air felt thick, as if something unseen was watching them, waiting. She shivered involuntarily, pulling her coat tighter around her. They drove for hours, stopping only once for gas at a lonely, dilapidated station on the outskirts of town. As David filled the tank, Claire got out to stretch her legs. The night air was cold and crisp, and she breathed it in deeply, hoping to clear her mind. She looked around. The area was deserted, the faint glow of the gas station's flickering neon sign, the only light in the otherwise blackened night. Suddenly, a movement caught her eye in the rearview mirror of the car. Her heart stopped. There, sitting in the back seat, was a shadowy figure, indistinct but unmistakable. It was the woman from the painting. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. It just sat there, its hollow eyes fixed on Emily. Claire's pulse raced as she blinked rapidly, her eyes trying to adjust. But when she looked back again, the shadow was gone, replaced by the sleeping forms of her children. She stumbled backward, her legs weak, nearly falling into the side of the car. David noticed her stumble and rushed over. "Claire, what's wrong?" he asked, concern etched across his face. "I saw her," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "She was sitting in the back seat, watching them." David stared at her, his expression unreadable, then shook his head. "It's just your nerves. We've been through hell, Claire. It's making us see things." "No, David, I saw her," Claire insisted, her voice rising. "I'm not imagining this. She's with us. She's following us." David's face softened, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "We'll figure this out," he whispered, though his voice was strained. "We'll find someone who can help us." Claire clung to him, wanting to believe that there was a solution, but deep down she feared that whatever had attached itself to them was beyond help. They drove through the night, finally stopping at a roadside motel in the early hours of the morning. The sky was still dark. The thin walls of the motel offered little comfort, but it was the best they could do for now. David checked them in, while Claire ushered the kids inside, their small hands wrapped tightly around hers. The motel room was sparse and cold, with a buzzing fluorescent light overhead, and an ancient television perched on a wobbly stand. It wasn't much, but it was a temporary refuge from the nightmare that had followed them. Emily was still groggy, rubbing her eyes as she crawled into one of the twin beds. Josh sat on the edge of his bed, silent and tense, his eyes darting around the room as though he, too, expected the woman to appear at any moment. As they settled in for the night, Claire stood by the window, staring out at the desolate parking lot below. The darkened sky seemed to press down on her, suffocating in its weight. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of fabric sent shivers down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was nearby, waiting. Just as she was about to turn away from the window, she saw something move in the parking lot. At first, it was just a shadow, slipping between the parked cars, but then it became clearer. She became clearer. The woman was standing there, beneath the flickering motel sign, her twisted face illuminated by the dim glow. She stared up at the room, her hollow eyes locking with Claire's. Claire gasped, stumbling backward. She turned to David, her voice shaking. "She's here, outside, right now." David rushed to the window but saw nothing. The parking lot was empty. He sighed and rubbed his forehead, clearly frustrated. "Claire, you need to rest. You're exhausted. We all are. Get some sleep." But Claire couldn't rest. The image of the woman standing outside burned into her mind. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, her body rigid with fear. At some point during the night, the buzzing of the motel's fluorescent light seemed to grow louder, droning in her ears like a swarm of bees. Then it flickered, once, twice, and then it went out, plunging the room into darkness. Claire shot up, her heart racing. "David," she whispered, but there was no response. Suddenly, the bed next to her creaked, the sound slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was shifting in the darkness. Claire's throat tightened and she reached out to where David should have been, but her hand touched only cold, empty sheets. Then, from the corner of the room, a soft, rasping voice broke the silence. It wasn't a human voice. It was low and guttural, almost like a whisper from another world. "You can't leave me?" Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled out of bed, her hands shaking violently. The voice came again, closer this time, filling the small room with a suffocating presence. "You belong to me." Claire's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor, her mind spinning in terror. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the darkness, she could make out the shape of the woman, her body contorted and twisted, her face a mask of pure malice. "David!" Claire screamed, her voice trembling with desperation. David bolted awake, his eyes wide with confusion. He rushed over to her, pulling her up from the floor, his voice frantic. "What's happening?" "She's here," Claire sobbed, clutching at his arms. "She's in the room." David turned on the light, and the harsh fluorescent glow filled the room once again. The woman was gone. There was nothing in the corner but an old armchair, draped in shadow. "Claire," David began, but he didn't need to finish. The look in his eyes said it all. He didn't believe her, not fully. But Claire knew what she had seen. The woman wasn't just haunting them. She was inside their lives now, woven into the very fabric of their reality. And no matter how far they ran, no matter how hard they tried to escape, she would always find them. The next morning, as they packed their things and prepared to leave the motel, Emily tugged on Claire's sleeve again. Her eyes were wide with fear, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom," Emily said, "she's in the mirror." Claire's heart stopped. Slowly, she turned toward the motel bathroom, where the mirror hung above the sink. There, reflected in the glass, was the faint outline of the woman, her hollow eyes watching them. The woman from the painting had followed them into every corner of their lives. And this time, there would be no escape. The chill in the motel room was stifling. The air felt heavy, charged with a presence that suffocated any remaining hope. Claire stared at the mirror where Emily had pointed. At first, the reflection appeared normal. The dull, worn walls of the bathroom, the cracked tile floor, and their own frightened faces staring back at them. But then, in the far corner of the glass, the woman's outline slowly emerged. Claire's breath hitched as the figure sharpened. The woman was grotesque now, her transformation complete. Her face, once a semblance of human beauty, was now a twisted, decaying mask. Her eyes, black as pitch, stared back through the mirror with a cold, lifeless hunger. The skin of her face was pulled tight, her jaw hanging at an unnatural angle, and her fingers were long and claw-like, as though she had been dragged out from a nightmare. "She won't leave us," Emily whispered, clutching Claire's hand, her small body trembling. Claire couldn't tear her eyes away from the reflection. She tried to speak, to tell Emily it would be okay, but the words died in her throat. The room felt like it was closing in around them, the shadows stretching and twisting, swallowing the light. The woman's mouth opened slightly as if she was about to speak or scream. David rushed into the bathroom, snapping Claire out of her trance. "What is it? What happened?" His voice was urgent, his face drawn tight with exhaustion and worry. Claire pointed to the mirror. "She's there. Look, she's in the mirror." David hesitated for a second, his eyes flicking toward the glass. His expression hardened, and he stepped closer, squinting. "I don't see anything," he muttered, his tone uncertain but tinged with disbelief. Claire's heart sank. She had seen this before. David's growing detachment from the terrifying reality unfolding around them. The woman's power wasn't just in her appearances. It was in the way she frayed their minds, made them question what was real. She wanted them to break. "No, she's right there," Claire insisted, her voice rising in desperation. But the figure in the mirror was already fading, like smoke dissolving into the night. The woman's twisted form melted away, leaving only the ordinary reflection of their family standing in the dull motel bathroom. David let out a slow breath, rubbing his hands over his face. "You need to rest, Claire," he said softly, his voice thick with fatigue. "We're all seeing things at this point." But Claire knew it wasn't just her mind playing tricks. She had seen the woman, and so had Emily. The woman was real, and she wasn't going to let them go. That night, Claire lay awake in bed, unable to shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edge of her vision, waiting for the moment to strike. The kids had finally fallen asleep, their exhaustion overtaking their fear, but Claire couldn't find the peace of slumber. Her thoughts churned, trying to piece together the strange events that had consumed their lives. There had to be a reason behind this haunting, some explanation that would allow them to break free. The painting. It all started with the painting. Claire rose quietly from the bed and slipped out of the room, careful not to wake David or the children. She needed answers, something concrete to explain the connection between the woman in the painting and their family. She grabbed her laptop from the small desk in the corner of the room and settled into the cold, hard chair. The dim glow of the screen illuminated her face as she searched for anything that might provide a clue. The painting had come from David's side of the family, a part of the inheritance left to them after the death of David's estranged uncle. Claire hadn't thought much of it at the time. It had seemed like an old, forgotten relic, nothing more. But now, she was certain that there was something deeply sinister tied to that portrait. She searched the uncle's name, Edward Sinclair, but there was little information to go on. He had lived a quiet, reclusive life in the countryside, far from any significant public records. Frustrated, Claire dug deeper, scanning old newspaper archives, obscure forums, and genealogy sites. Hours passed, and just as she was about to give up, she found something. A blog post from a local historian caught her eye, detailing the history of a family curse. A curse tied to an ancient portrait that had been passed down through generations. The Sinclair family had once been wealthy landowners in the 1800s, and Edward Sinclair's great-great-grandfather, Ambrose Sinclair, had been notorious for dabbling in the occult. According to legend, Ambrose had become obsessed with immortality and made a deal with a dark entity, offering something in return for eternal life. The deal had involved his wife, Eleanor Sinclair, the woman in the painting. Claire's heart raced as she read on. Eleanor had been a beautiful woman, but after Ambrose's pact, her beauty began to wither. The painting of her, meant to immortalize her youth, had instead become cursed, reflecting her gradual descent into madness and monstrous transformation. It was said that Eleanor's soul had been trapped in the painting, bound to her eternal decay, and that anyone who possessed the painting would be haunted by her restless spirit. "She's bound to us," Claire whispered, her hands shaking as she closed the laptop. The curse wasn't just a story, it was real, and somehow their family had inherited it. A soft knock echoed from the motel room door, startling Claire from her thoughts. Her heart leaped into her throat. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. Claire stood, her legs unsteady, and approached the door, her hand hovering over the knob. "Mom!" Emily's small voice called out from behind her. Claire turned to see her daughter standing in the doorway of the bedroom, rubbing her eyes. "What's that sound?" "Go back to bed, sweetheart," Claire whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's nothing." But Emily didn't move. She just stood there, staring at the door, her face pale. "She's outside," Emily whispered. "She wants to come in." Claire froze, her hand inches from the knob. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound, like a voice but not quite human. Claire backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's nothing." But Emily didn't move. She just stood there, staring at the door, her face pale. "She's outside," Emily whispered. "She wants to come in." Claire froze, her hand inches from the knob. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound, like a voice but not quite human. Claire backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to leave," she whispered, grabbing Emily by the hand and rushing back into the bedroom. "David, wake up, we have to go." David stirred groggily, confused by the sudden urgency in Claire's voice. "What? What's going on?" "There's no time to explain. We have to leave now." But before they could make it to the door, the room grew cold, unnaturally cold. The lights flickered, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, twisting and stretching toward them. Claire's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she realized they were trapped. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was the woman, the thing from the painting, fully formed and monstrous. Her body was grotesque, her limbs elongated, her face barely recognizable as human. Her hollow eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her mouth stretched into a wide, ghastly grin. "You can't escape," the woman hissed, her voice echoing in the small room. David grabbed the kids, pulling them behind him. "What do you want from us?" he shouted, his voice trembling with fear. The woman's grin widened, and her voice lowered to a whisper. "I want what was promised." Claire's mind raced. She knew what the woman wanted. The curse had been set in motion long ago, and now Eleanor's twisted soul demanded the price of the pact. "No!" Claire shouted, stepping forward. "You won't take them. This ends now." The woman lunged forward, her skeletal hand reaching for Emily. But Claire moved faster, grabbing a shard of broken glass from the floor and slashing at the woman's outstretched arm. The glass passed through her like smoke, but it bought them a moment. "Run!" Claire screamed. They fled into the night, the woman's twisted form fading behind them. But Claire knew as they ran that they would never truly be free. The curse of the Sinclair family would follow them wherever they went, a shadow that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And somewhere, in the dark recesses of the world, the woman from the painting would always be watching,